What's the creepiest or most unexplainable thing you've ever seen that you haven't shared anywhere? A long time ago, back in primary school, my friend and I decided to explore the school compound on a Sunday. We came in the wee hours of the morning, and since it was a Sunday, the place was completely empty. We were walking along a corridor on the first floor when, suddenly, we heard a thunderous noise above us. You know the sound of dragging a chair or table across the floor. It was exactly that, but it sounded like entire classrooms full of tables and chairs being shoved around at once. It was loud, very loud, and it was completely out of nowhere. There was no reason for anyone to be in the school, moving dozens of tables and chairs on their own at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. We froze, stared at each other, and bolted. After we got out of the school, my friend turned to me and asked, "Did you hear the lady screaming in the corridor?" I told him no. Then he looked at me strangely and said, "I didn't hear the dragging sounds." My grandfather passed away several years ago after many years of dialysis. As he got older, we were told that the treatment wouldn't last forever, that it would become less effective, and eventually, they would have to stop it. He was 83 when he passed, always fit and healthy, and the dialysis had kept him going for a good few years. When he became unwell and was taken to the hospital, they stopped his dialysis and told us he probably had 48 to 72 hours left. So, all of the family made our way to the hospital and stayed with him as much as we could. They kept him comfortable and made sure he wasn't in pain. As he neared the end, he was in and out of a lucid state, mostly in a slumber, almost living his memories, mumbling and muttering. When he did wake up, he would stare transfixed at a point on the ceiling, talking to God knows who, clear as day, before drifting off again. This happened all night. Moments before he passed, he suddenly sat up, staring at the same spot on the ceiling, speaking clearer than he had in days. Holding my grandmother's hand, he turned to her, looked her dead in the eyes, and said, "They're asking me if I want to take a message over to anyone. Is there anything you want to say to someone?" My grandmother, stunned, said there wasn't. He lay back down, closed his eyes, and passed peacefully. The whole room was silent. Every single hair on my body stood on end. I am not religious, but in that moment, I felt like I should have gone straight to a church and started praying or something. My mother, who has been a nurse for years, told me that when a lot of people die, they fixate on a point on the ceiling and talk to whatever is there. Her telling me that did not help at all. Bizarre. When I was 20, I visited a town in Italy that has several medieval towers you can climb. My girlfriend didn't want to climb any, so I went up one on my own. At the time, I was the only person going up. It was a sunny day when I entered the tower. The stairs wound around the edge of the tower, and there were no windows. Climbing the tower took at most 5 minutes. At the top, there was a ladder and a trapdoor that led to the roof. I pushed it open and immediately noticed something wasn't right. The weather had changed dramatically. The sky was now overcast and threatening. I don't remember if there was thunder, but I was genuinely concerned about lightning, being at the top of a tall, exposed tower. I cautiously climbed onto the roof just to have a quick look before heading straight back down. The roof was surrounded by a metal cage of bars, clearly designed to prevent anyone from falling or jumping. Then, I heard thunder and saw electricity arc between some of the bars. It wasn't a blinding lightning strike, just arcing electricity. At that moment, I was convinced the tower was about to be struck and descended as fast as I could. When I reached the bottom, I was shocked to see that the weather was still sunny with a perfectly clear sky. My girlfriend immediately noticed that I was shaken. When I told her I thought there had been lightning, she was amazed, because the weather hadn't changed at all while I was up there. I've tried to tell this story a few times, but it's just too strange for people to believe. I have no explanation. I'm a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, I'm not religious, and I've never had another experience like this. And yet, when I was 5, my identical twin sister and I both caught scarlet fever. We were from the US, but my dad's project had temporarily relocated us to India, and we weren't used to the food and water there. By the end of the fever, we both fell into a coma. One day, I woke up to my mom and aunt screaming and crying, holding my sister because she was unresponsive and not breathing. They were doing chest compressions and CPR, but nothing was working. I was desperately trying to get their attention, confused because I didn't understand what was happening. I gave up and went back to my room to go back to sleep. That's when I saw something strange. In the corner of the room, where my sister's bed was, I saw her lying there, breathing fine. I was relieved, until I walked back out into the living room and realized I was looking at myself in my mom's arms as she tried to revive me. I saw my own eyes flicker open, and then, everything went dark. I woke up weeks later in the hospital next to my sister and mom, who had also caught the fever from us. My mom later told me that I had come so close to not making it, and that when they were trying to wake me up, I was completely lifeless. They thought they had lost me, so the ambulance rushed all three of us to the ICU. To this day, I still have no idea how I witnessed my own near-death experience. I used to live in rural Texas and was driving down a farm-to-market road one night in thick fog. I was in an old pickup truck, barely going 20 to 30 miles per hour because I couldn't see far ahead, which in hindsight was a really good thing. As I came around a turn, I saw a massive, hulking figure lurching across the road. I slowed down and pulled up to pass, and that's when I saw it. It was the biggest hog I've ever seen in my life, easily 400 pounds, dead in the road, probably wrecked whatever poor car hit it. And dragging it off the road was an absolutely massive white shaggy dog. I was in a pickup truck, and when it lifted its head and locked eyes with me, we were eye level. I froze. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. It had mud-stained white fur, a big blocky head, a long wolf-like tail, and these huge, glowing yellow eyes. It looked almost like a Pyrenees, which are common in that area, but much bigger and more powerful, with a head shaped like a Saint Bernard. I just sat there, completely caught off guard. After a few seconds, which felt way longer, it put its head back down, grabbed a chunk of hog, and kept dragging it off the road like I wasn't even there. Let me break this down. This thing was smart enough to move the animal it wanted to eat, large and strong enough to drag a 400-pound hog across pavement, and tall enough to look me dead in the eye in a truck. I have no idea if it was some freak mutant farm dog, a wolf, a spirit, or something else entirely. But I know one thing for sure, I'd like to never see it again. I used to live in the middle of nowhere. The town had less than 200 people in it. I worked through the night in one of the metro areas, and it was about a 40-minute drive, with about 15 of it on a county road. I used to think I would see things in the fields all the time, coyotes, deer, whatever. Never thought twice. Well, one morning I was on my way home at about 3 a.m., and there was a little bridge to cross right before I got to my road. As I was closing in on the bridge, I saw something pearl white just hanging out in the middle of the road. I figured it was probably a swan and that it would move. As I got closer, I realized that swans are not that big. I was in an F-150, and it was at eye level with me. When its wings opened up, they literally covered both lanes of traffic. I swerved to miss it but still clipped part of its wing. I slammed on my brakes and turned around, but whatever it was had completely disappeared without a trace. Never saw it again. If it was a bird, that was the biggest bird I have ever seen. Back when I was 9 or so, my friend and I were having a sleepover. His parents were at a dinner, and his older brother was probably out getting stoned somewhere. Around 9 p.m., his parents called to say that dinner had turned into drinks, so they'd be out a little longer. We didn't think much of it. We were young, playing Minecraft on the Xbox 360 in the basement. Then we heard the front door open. It had a very distinct, eerie creak when it moved. We barely looked up, figuring, oh, it's probably just your brother. Then we heard footsteps upstairs. His kitchen was right above the basement, so we just assumed his brother had come home for munchies. But then we heard another set of footsteps. That made us pause. Still, we figured it was his parents or a stoner friend of his brother. And then, scratching at the basement door. We froze. We looked at each other like, are you hearing that too? He didn't have any pets. Since I was the oldest by 2 months, I got up to check. I opened the door, baseball bat in hand. Nothing. I yelled upstairs, Jim, you're not scaring us. Stop it. Silence. I sat back down and we kept playing. Then, the scratching started at the window. At this point, we were terrified. One of us watched the door while the other kept an eye on the window. Then, scratching at the door again. I swung the door open, bat ready, nothing there. We barricaded the door and blocked the window, then just sat there, waiting. For the next half hour, there was nothing. Somehow, we fell asleep. The next morning, his dad came down, pounding on the door. We took down the barricade, and as soon as he stepped in, he was furious. Why the hell did you guys rip open the screen door? We ran upstairs, and sure enough, the front door's screen was shredded. We tried explaining what happened, swearing it wasn't us, and that his brother must have done it to scare us. But then his dad said something that made our blood run cold. Jim wasn't home at all last night. We dropped him off in the city with his friends. My friend's house was half an hour from the city, and none of his brother's friends had a car. We looked at each other, completely speechless. His parents didn't believe us. They called my parents, and we ended up splitting the cost to replace both the basement door, which had tons of scratch marks, and the screen door. To this day, whenever we meet up, we still talk about it. It's been almost 10 years, and I still don't have anything close to an explanation for what happened. My best friend and I were having a sleepover at her grandma's house, enjoying the newly renovated attic, which was supposed to become her little teenage apartment. Everything was brand new, fresh furniture, a huge comfy couch, and clean white and pink shelves screwed into the wall. The night went just like you'd imagine for two 15-year-old girls, painting nails, watching DVDs, and gossiping about school. By around 3 a.m., we decided to get some sleep and left the room to crash in the bed next door. Only a few minutes later, we heard a faint scratching noise, followed by a loud bang coming from the room we had just left. We rushed back in and saw that one of the shelves, which had been securely screwed into the wall, was now lying on the floor, almost 4 meters away from where it was supposed to be. Not like it had just fallen off. No, it had been launched. There was an almost 2 centimeter deep hole in the floor where it landed. The holes in the wall where the screws had been looked like something had ripped the shelf straight out, tearing through wood and concrete. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I was working in a retail store in a pretty sketchy area. There was this lady who was obviously a heavy drug user or ex-drug user, probably in her 50s or 60s. She was notorious on my block for being crazy, but she'd visit me all the time and told me she thought I was cute. It was really bizarre cause she looked like a crackhead, but she'd act like a teenage girl around me. I tried to be nice to her cause she was known for being volatile. Anyway, on Christmas Eve, she packed an entire Christmas dinner, which she told me was all home-cooked Guyanese food, along with a cologne set. As she was leaving, she suddenly squatted down on the floor, threw her hand up, and started cackling. Yes, cackling, which faded into a giggle. Never saw her again. I was young, and digital cameras were a new thing. I was obsessed with them, and my mom would buy me different cameras to try. If we didn't like one, we'd return it. We bought a cheap one, but indoor pictures always had a red and yellow hue. It had long exposure, so a lot of the pictures ended up with streaks and weird distortions. One day, I took a picture of my room and plugged the camera into the computer to view the image. And there he was. A full-blown man, wearing sweatpants, a sweatshirt, and a hat. There were light streaks in the picture, but he looked completely different from the imperfections, like there was actually a man there, caught mid-stride, walking through my room. I called my mom right before writing this to ask if she remembers that moment. She claimed she didn't. I don't believe her, because that camera immediately disappeared after this event, and she never bought me another one. Now, in my late 20s, when I think about it, it still brings tears to my eyes. The house I grew up in was so scary, so strange. I've never felt that way in any other home. Something was off. My husband and I were walking in the downtown area of Seaside, Oregon. It was late December, so the streets were pretty sparse, and many shops were closed since it was also a Sunday morning. I stepped into a Celtic shop, and it was full of people, yet the moment I entered, everyone fell silent. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt heavy and blurry. The woman behind the counter said something to me and tried to hand me a pendant. Immediately, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of darkness and dread. Everything felt black. It was as if something was pressing down on my chest. I had never felt such darkness before. Somehow, I managed to run out the door, and the moment I hit the sidewalk, I was completely fine, as if nothing had happened. My husband wanted to go in because he loves places like that, and it was then that I realized something strange. Why hadn't he gone in with me in the first place? We were newly married, had been walking arm in arm, and yet, for some reason, he just stopped at the entrance. I simply told him, no, we're not going in there, and I dragged him away. I have been to Seaside many times since then, and the shop is no longer there. Even stranger, I can't find the place where I remember it being. I've got 2 stories that I can't explain at all. My best friend lived on a farm about 15 minutes outside of the town I grew up in. By 18, I was very familiar with all the roads around his place. One night, we're coming back from band practice, we were in a garage band, and we pass by a farmhouse and notice the top bedroom light is on. This is extremely odd because nobody had lived there since we were in middle school. It was abandoned after a farmer took his own life in front of his family. After something like that, it's hard to sell. Anyway, we're cruising past, and my buddy tells me to turn around. So I do, and we stop at the entrance to the driveway. Sure enough, the bedroom light is on, no other lights, no vehicles, and the gate was still closed and looked like it had been for a while. Even creepier, there was someone, or something, up there. The place had been boarded up, and we didn't see any signs of someone going in. We watched for maybe 5 minutes, it just seemed to pace around the room, then it turned towards the window, the same window we were looking at. That was all we needed to see, and we got the hell out of Dodge. The next day, we decided to go back and take a closer look. From the outside, everything was still boarded up, so who knows what that was. About a year or two later, they tore the place down. A guy I know was on the crew, and when I told him our story, he just shook his head and said there was no way a light could have worked in that house, the power had been cut off for years. The second story happened when I was driving home late one night from a bonfire. Since I drove myself, I hadn't been drinking. I was a few miles from town when I suddenly saw what looked like a woman on the side of the road. She looked like she was about to run into the road with her hands up, signaling me to stop. Out of instinct, I slammed my brakes hard. But when I stopped, there was nobody. Just as I started moving again, a pickup with no headlights on flew through the intersection in front of me without stopping. If I hadn't hit my brakes, that truck would have broadsided me at full speed. I called the police and reported them for unsafe driving. The next day, I got a call from them saying they caught the guys. All 3 in the truck were hammered, and the driver already had a suspended license. To this day, I swear I saw a woman on the road. There's no other reason I would have slammed on my brakes like that. Ghost or angel, who knows, but whatever it was probably saved my life. Was driving back to my dorm in Florida. I'm from NC, so it was an all-night drive. Just cruising along I-95 going about 130 kilometers per hour when, out of nowhere, I skidded and quickly lost control of my truck. Next thing I knew, I was slammed into the underpass of a bridge. I saw the entire front of my truck flatten against the wall. In that moment, I felt a sharp impact through my body, and the last thing I saw was the airbag deploying as my face moved forward. Then, immediately after, I flew straight out of my bed and slammed into the railing at the foot of it. My roommate was there. He grabbed me and made sure I was okay. He said I had just been sleeping when, all of a sudden, I lurched forward and slammed my head into the rail. I was so shaken because it felt so real. I insisted we go out to my truck because I needed to see it for myself. Everything was fine. Nothing was wrong with it. This was around midnight, and my roommate was pretty concerned that I felt so strongly about the whole thing. He suggested I go to the counselor in the morning. I agreed. We were walking back to the dorm when his phone started going off. His father was in tears, barely able to talk, breaking down as he told my roommate that his brother had been found lifeless in his vehicle under an overpass near his home in Missouri. My roommate, shocked, said something about how he couldn't believe his brother had been speeding because he always drove slow, and that his tires had been fine just last week. His dad, still crying, suddenly stopped and asked how he knew that the tires had caused him to skid and that he had been speeding. We never told his mom about it. His dad did not take it well when we tried to explain. I was in high school, watching TV with my mom and dad. Out of nowhere, my dad told me to lock the front door because he had a feeling of overwhelming dread. I was lying on the floor near the door, about to laugh it off, but he got serious, really serious, and told me again. So, I got up and locked it. We kept watching TV, Cheers, around 1987 or 88, and maybe 10 minutes later, the doorknob slowly started turning. It was loud enough that we all looked at it, and sure enough, it was moving. We stared at each other in shock. My dad asked, "Did you see that?" I just nodded. At first, we were frozen, but after a few seconds, we snapped out of it and decided to check outside. It was dark, and we didn't see anything, just an empty driveway. Whoever it was had already walked away. Cut to about 2 or 3 hours later. I was in my room when I heard screaming, someone pounding on our back sliding glass door, yelling for help. It was our next-door neighbor's youngest son, about 11 years old. He was crying, terrified, begging us to call the police. His family had just been home invasion robbed and held hostage, for the entire time since our doorknob had turned. If I remember right, 3 or 4 men had walked right through their unlocked front door. They had only left the screen latched. Bad things happened, but everyone survived. My dad isn't psychic, but this is still the strangest thing I've ever witnessed. Since then, I always lock the door every time I enter the house, even in the middle of the day. This experience convinced me that there's more than what we can see. A spiritual realm, something we don't understand. Why did my dad feel that dread? Why did he take it so seriously? And why, after all that, didn't we call the police? I still wish we had done something that could have changed the outcome for our neighbors. To this day, when someone says they have a bad feeling, I take it seriously. My grandma died of leukemia 2 years ago. We are Buddhist, and part of our belief is that the soul of the deceased stays in the living world for 49 days before passing into the afterlife. A week after my grandma's funeral, my family gathered for dinner at my parents' restaurant. We own a Chinese restaurant. We left an extra seat and setting for my grandma. Since I was sitting next to her spot, I was the one who filled her plate. I made sure to scoop a bit of every dish onto it, including her in our family meal. That night, I had a dream. I was back at the restaurant. Everything looked exactly the same as it had earlier in the evening, except this time, my grandma was there. She was sitting in the empty seat we had left for her, wearing the same outfit we had dressed her in for her casket. She was watching our family and smiling. I remember her expression so clearly. She looked happy, proud of the legacy she had left behind, but there was also a little sadness behind that smile. When I saw her, I immediately tried to get my family's attention, but no one could hear me. I turned back around, and my grandma shushed me and told me to enjoy the dinner. Then I woke up. It was a strange experience, but it also gave me a sense of closure. She went downhill so fast once the doctors started her on chemo. Basically, about 2 years back when I was 16 and had just started driving, I was on my way back from band rehearsal at around 10 o'clock one night. Nothing unusual, same drive, same town around me. The roads branching off offered several different routes home, but I usually stuck to just 2. A well-lit path through the suburbs or a darker, faster back road. Since it was late, I took the quicker, darker route. Along this forest-lined road, there is only one distinct light, a bright street lamp posted at a 4-way stop, right in the middle of my commute home. It is the only street lamp, cross street, or sign on that entire road. As usual, I accelerated past it, reading to myself the name of the street clearly illuminated by the lamp. Rogers Trail. I kept driving, knowing the next stop would be my house. Or so I thought. Way down the road, I saw a streetlight coming up. I hit the brakes, thinking I had made a wrong turn or something. As I got closer, I glanced at the street sign, hoping to orient myself. My jaw dropped. Rogers Trail. I inched past the 4-way stop for the second time, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what just happened. It was 10:30 now, and I just wanted to get home. I shook it off, gunned it down the road, only to see another streetlight ahead. And once again, you guessed it, Rogers Trail. The same 4-way stop. The same street. The same sign. At this point, I was seriously questioning if I was even awake. I kept going, passing Rogers Trail 6 or 7 more times before I finally made it home at around 11:15. I told my parents I had grabbed dinner with some friends and went straight to bed. I have thought about sharing this story before, but to most people, it would probably sound like total BS. I am not asking anyone to believe me, but I swear this happened. And I still have no explanation. I was in middle school, and my sister was in high school. She was out with her friends, and I went downstairs to grab a snack while my parents were in the living room. Out of nowhere, I started crying and telling them I was worried about my sister. She didn't have a cell phone yet, so there wasn't much we could do. It turned out she had been in an accident. She was fine, but it was scary. A few months later, I was at school when I suddenly started crying again. I called my mom and told her to call my grandmother. She didn't answer, so they called her neighbor. The neighbor checked on her and found that she had fallen in the tub and broken her foot. She had been sitting there overnight. I have trusted my gut ever since. When I was about 8, my family went up to a campsite near a lake. We went with several other families, and they brought their kids too. One thing this other kid and I liked to do was search the shallow areas for crawdads. As I was searching, I started venturing further out until the water was up to my waist. The water wasn't completely clear, but it wasn't muddy either. I could see the pale sandy area of the shallows and the darker area where the water dropped off. I didn't know that at the time. I kept moving forward and suddenly stepped into the darker, deeper water. Before I could fall in, a pale, slender arm grabbed my leg and pushed me back into the shallows. All I saw was the arm as it sank back into the deeper water before I scrambled back to shore. I remember it clear as day, but nothing ever turned up from that lake. No bodies, no drownings, nothing. My parents still think I made it up. I had one story a minute ago, now I have two. The first happened about 10 years ago when I was living with some friends and their 4 kids. One night, I was babysitting while my friends had a date night. It was around 9 p.m., the kids had wound down, and we were in the living room watching TV. I stepped into the master bedroom to grab something for one of them. I wasn't gone more than 10 to 15 seconds, but when I came back, the youngest boy, only 10 months old and barely able to crawl, was missing from the living room. Just then, I heard him screaming. I followed the sound through the kitchen and dining room to a back bedroom, where I found him sitting in the middle of the pitch-black room, freaking the hell out. The other kids, ages 6, 4, and 2, had seemingly not moved from their spots in the few seconds I was gone, and they had no explanation for how their baby brother had ended up there. As if that wasn't creepy enough, it gets worse. Their grandfather had died in that very bedroom the previous year. The second story is short but funny, and it just happened right before I started writing this. I was lying in bed alone in my office, reading all these scary stories, getting that good creeped out feeling. After finishing a particularly unnerving one, I decided to give the room a quick glance, just to make sure nothing was lurking in the shadows. The last thing my eyes landed on was the video baby monitor, sitting just a foot from my face on the nightstand. On it, my 6-month-old son, suddenly wide awake, staring directly at the camera, in complete silence. I was out cycling late in the evening. The sun had set, but the streetlights hadn't come on yet. I was on a road I knew well. Up ahead, about 300 meters away, was a blind turn. People usually go very slow on that turn. I was cycling toward it when, suddenly, an image flashed in my mind. Me, lying in blood. I stopped immediately on the side of the road. Out of nowhere, it felt like the words, Red CR, were being screamed in my brain. My head started pounding. I felt sick. I wanted to puke. I had no idea what to think, and I was honestly shaken by that image. And then, just a second later, a red Hyundai flies past me at insane speed, cutting through the blind turn like a maniac. Had to be going at least 110 to 130 kilometers per hour. I watched his tires screech, and I knew, if I hadn't stopped, he would have hit me head-on. I would be lying in blood. This has never happened to me again. I have no idea what it was. It's unexplainable. I used to live in a house with 2 roommates, let's call them Anna and Erica. I lived on the 2nd floor, while Anna and Erica lived downstairs. Every night, I would hear this thud, thud coming from below. I would go check, and it always seemed to come from Anna's room. At the time, I assumed she was doing burpees or working out late at night, which seems dumb looking back. I never talked to Erica about it because I thought maybe I was imagining things, and since I was upstairs, it didn't really bother me. Fast forward 2 years, and we all move into a new house with another roommate. This time, Anna, Erica, and I all live on the same floor upstairs. That's when things got worse. I started hearing the thud, thud even louder. One night, I walked up to Anna's door, and it sounded like she was hitting herself against the wall, whispering, and crying or laughing. When she left her room, I noticed her sheets scattered on the floor. I finally brought it up to Erica, and she admitted she had been hearing it too. Anna started staying at her parents' house more often, but every time she came home, we would hear the same noise. When we started questioning her, she gave weird excuses like, "Oh, I was moving furniture. My porch door was swinging open." After that, she barely came home, maybe once a month, just to pick up some clothes. It was so strange. I don't think we'll ever get an explanation. A number of years ago, I was using an online chat site and got talking to a woman who claimed to live around 50 miles from me. We chatted quite happily for a couple of days, but on the 3rd day, a Saturday night, she seemed different somehow. Something just didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She explained that she was drinking, and I assumed that was the reason behind her melancholy mood. We kept chatting, and she turned on her webcam so I could see her drinking as we talked. Over the next couple of hours, her mood grew darker. She seemed distressed but was hesitant to say why. She left for a bit and came back about 30 minutes later, appearing even drunker and more upset. This time, she had a stack of tablets on the table in front of her. She said she couldn't handle it anymore and began taking them one by one. I had no idea what kind of medication it was. She kept taking more, and her speech became more and more slurred. Suddenly, I was in a terrible position. Was I really watching someone take their own life on a live stream, completely unable to do anything? All I had was a name and a town, both of which could be false. I made up an excuse that I needed to go to the toilet, left the room, and called my local police. I explained everything, and they took down all the details I had. They told me to go back and keep her talking while trying to get more information. A plainclothes officer was sent to my house, and while I was chatting with her, he pulled up the chat logs and history on his laptop. By this time, her speech was barely understandable, and at some point, she knocked over the webcam, making it impossible to see her. Then, the connection was lost. Was this real? Was it fake? I had no idea. The officer stayed on the phone with the station, giving them all the information he had gathered, and then he left, leaving me to sit there wondering what had just happened. The next evening, I got a call from the local police station. They wanted to thank me. The police had managed to trace her through her IP address and had sent officers to her location. It was, in fact, a real situation. She had truly tried to take her own life. She was taken to the hospital and was undergoing treatment. When my daughter was very young, 3 to 4 years old, we were on a family vacation at a state park lodge. Our room had exposed wood ceiling beams to match the rustic decor, important later. It was supposed to be nap time, but my daughter was quietly playing by herself, chatting away, while my wife and I were reading on the other bed. Out of nowhere, my daughter turns to me and asks for a piece of rope. I ask why she needs it, and she casually replies, "It's for my friend, the purple girl on the ceiling." My wife immediately asks, "What friend?" Without hesitation, my daughter responds, "I've been talking with the little purple girl hanging from that wood up there." Points to the ceiling beam. She asked me for another piece of rope. Nap time was officially over. We quickly gathered our things and left the room. My mother-in-law passed away at age 92. During the funeral preparations, my husband mentioned that near the end of her life, his mother had expressed a wish for 2 old neighbors, from a place she had moved away from 50 years prior, to attend her funeral. He told her he would do his best, but it was doubtful they still lived there, and he wasn't sure how to find them since they had very common Hispanic names. The day after she passed, my husband traveled to her old neighborhood, but of course, the neighbors had long since moved, and no one knew where they had gone. That Sunday, just before the funeral, my husband and I attended Mass at the church of his youth, the same church his mother had asked to be buried from. Neither of us had been to that large church in decades. We took a spot near the back. After Mass began, a man came and sat in the pew directly in front of us. My husband said a silent prayer to his mother, apologizing that he couldn't find the neighbors and asking for her forgiveness. During the service, there is a moment when everyone exchanges a handshake of peace. The man in front of us turned around, and, startled, called my husband by name. It was the son of the neighbors my husband had been searching for. My husband didn't even recognize him, but the man recognized him instantly. He had just been visiting his parents for the weekend at their new home and, at the last minute, decided to stop for Mass before leaving town. We exchanged information, and, just as his mother had asked, her neighbors were at her funeral 2 days later. If I hadn't been there, I would not have believed it. About a year ago, I was in the car by myself on the freeway. It was a clear, sunny day. I was driving about 20 yards behind a semi. I glanced down for literally a second to adjust the volume on the stereo. When I looked up, everything had changed. The sky had gone completely gray, and a mist of fog was floating in the air. The semi in front of me had rolled onto its side and was sliding backwards, straight toward me. I knew I didn't have time to avoid it. I was still going 105 kilometers per hour, and there was a car behind me, so I couldn't slam on the brakes. Panic hit me like a truck. I was completely overwhelmed by the knowledge that I was about to die. In that split second, I saw my daughter's face in my mind. The weight of knowing I wouldn't see her grow up crushed me. It was the worst thing I have ever felt: terror, panic, devastation, desperation, remorse. Time slowed down as I watched the semi slide closer and closer. I started to suck in a breath, I think probably to scream, and then I blinked. Suddenly, the semi was upright in its lane, still about 20 yards in front of me, driving completely normally. The sky was sunny. The fog was gone. It was like nothing had happened. But my hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard that they hurt. My heart was pounding. I started shaking uncontrollably, pulled over on the side of the freeway, and almost threw up. I called my husband and told him what had happened. He suggested that I had either hallucinated or driven through a fog patch where the sunlight refracted in a way that played tricks on my eyes. But there was no fog anywhere after I blinked. The only thing in my rearview mirror was the same car that had been behind me the whole time. I can still picture it clear as day. I was not sick. I was not on drugs. I have never hallucinated. I have no logical explanation. But there is a part of me that believes I died that day in an alternate reality, that the experience was so intense, I felt it in this one. Or maybe the universe was sending me a warning. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but I have no other way to make sense of it. I am a logical, skeptical person, but this shook me to my core. I do not drive behind semis anymore. Ever.